The art of portrait painting is not only creating a realistic image, not only feeling your way through the canvas, but it's also about understanding what it is that you're looking at and distilling it into simple form and structure. My name is Yupari, and I'd like to invite you to this week's portrait painting demonstration, where we will be creating this painting in real time using a 6-color palette. That color palette is titanium white, burnt umber, cadmium red medium, cadmium orange, yellow ochre, and ivory black. And for my mediums, to the left of the cup, I just have regular odorless mineral spirits, and to the right, I have a 1/5 stand oil to 4/5 paint thinner mixture. And the brushes that I will be using in the start, I will have bristle brushes, and then as the painting progresses, I will move on to more synthetic brushes. The canvas I'm working on is just a regular cotton canvas, 11 by 14 inches, toned with a neutral gray acrylic and then a little light wash of burnt umber that I let dry over a couple days, burnt umber oil paint. And now as my drawing color, I'm also going to be using burnt umber, and my paintbrush is a size 2 filbert bristle brush, and I just dipped it in very lightly into some of my odorless mineral spirits, very lightly, just so that the paint could run a little bit more freely. The start of a painting is really a nice time to explore and let the brush loose, moving around, making straight lines and angles, just trying to get an idea of where the entire head is going to fit onto the surface of this canvas. I just very loosely blocked in an outside shape for the model's hair, and I have two little marks for where I think the top and the bottom of the face is going to be placed, but nothing is set in stone yet here. I'm just trying to get a feel for the canvas. I'm trying to get a feel for the shapes. I'm painting much more from the spirit right now, though I am trying to nail the proportions relative to one another as quickly as possible, which means I'm trying to use very minimal lines, very minimal straight lines and angles to give me the overall outside shape, the outer structure of the model's head. I think it's a good idea to keep in mind that we are drawing the pose and not the model. We are thinking about the shape and not the person. And it's a very kind of a cold thing to think about. At least it seems kind of cold to me when I say it out loud, that we're not thinking about this as a person. We're thinking about it as a set of shapes, but that's just what makes sense to me, and I hope it makes sense to you, to liberate yourself from that idea that you're painting a person. So instead of painting a person, let's look at the angle in between the neck. Let's look at the simple straight line that we can run across the center of the face to give us that center line. Let's think about a structure that we can understand its highest point, its lowest point, its furthest point left, furthest point right, and just a simple structure that we can understand. Just a few little marks of the brush now to indicate where I think that the axis of the eyes is going to go, very loosely moving it around. So I'm really trying to own this structure. I'm really trying to have it work for me. This is a object that is in motion that I can freely control. Now, as far as the accuracy of the drawing, the only thing that's going on in my head right now is that the head is not straight on. It's a little bit angled to the right, a tad bit 3/4 to the right, and given my center line is almost centered, but just a little bit to the right. So that is the only bit of information that I have at this point that is going to stay planted. So the rest of the painting is pretty much in flux, and I'm trying to paint more from my intuition. I'm using a little bit more intuition than I am analytical thinking. So I like to start that way. You could start in a much more rigid way. You could start in a much more loose way. It really just matters that you relate your shapes to one another. And in the end of the day, nobody's really going to know or really going to question how you got your proportions or how you got your likeness. But for me, I just like to work through a simple set of shapes so that I can carve more intricate shapes on top of. And so that's what I did. I had the shapes of the eye socket, a little bar for where I think the nose is going to go, and for the mouth. Nothing more elaborate than that. No use for details or anything at this stage. And so since this video is more focused on form and structure, I'm not really going to delve too much into how to draw the proportions of the face. Now, I do have a video that's solely on the purpose of drawing the portrait, a charcoal drawing video, and I'll leave a link to that video in the description if you want to check that one out. So the way that I'm going to approach this painting is I did a simple block in for where I think that the model is going to be turned and the position that the model is going to be in, and then I'm going to fill in these dark masses of color and value. A mass is just a large region of color and value. And so I have a large mass for the hair and a large mass for the shadow shapes. And nothing too articulated yet. I don't quite know where everything is going to fit yet, so everything is still kind of in flux. But I want to get my darks in there as quickly as possible, especially when I'm working in this way where I'm using a drawing brush, an eraser brush, and then maybe some paper towel to push the paint around. Right now I'm carving the outside of the model's hair with another bristle brush, clean bristle brush dipped into a little bit of the odorless mineral spirits, and I use that brush just to draw a little more of an accurate shape now for the mass of the model's hair. Now just carving out a simple shape with my paper towel. I just have a little piece of paper towel and I carved out some little shapes and some indications for where I think that the iris is going to go, where I think that the entire eye socket is going to fit on that large mass that I had earlier. And then the same thing with the nose. I just want to have a simple shape for where I think that the nostrils are going to go and the wing of the nose. Nothing more complicated than that. And as I mentioned before, I have a separate video on just drawing the portrait with charcoal. And in any case, I'm trying to feel out the shapes, but now at this stage I really just want to have everything where I want it to be, because I'm going to be moving on into form and structure. So with this video I'm going to leave this drawing be in the stage that it is at, so that once I get my paint ready I'm going to have a nice foundation for the colors and the values to rest on top of. Talking about form and structure, let's take a look now at this image. So what I did was, once the painting was dry, I put a sheet of glass over it and drew out the planes of the face using a dry erase marker. So looking at the top, we have a simple division of shapes. So that round looking shape with the highlight in the middle is the front of the skull protruding, and as we get lower we have the frontal ridge of the skull, and then as we get even lower we have the whole structures of the eye sockets and the glabella. The glabella is in this area right here. Moving to the side now, we have the zygomatic region. The zygomaticus muscles wrapping around the side of the face, and then moving down we have, of course, the nose, the top plane of the nose, the side plane of the nose. And this whole structure right here, this encompasses the mouth. It's the orbicularis oris, and it is the muscle that allows you to make that kissing face, and it is wrapped around the mouth, and then as it folds closer into the mandible, it creates this plane here for the chin. So that is pretty much the structure of the human head, and in particular the structure that is going to be used in the development of these planes and these values. Now form is the application of value throughout a surface, and I'm talking about form in a painting. I'm not talking about form in any other kind of definition. So form is developed through the application of values on the surface, and the values are going to change relative to the position of the given form relative to its light source. And so right now what I'm doing is I'm mixing up the flesh tones that I believe that I'll be using in this painting. And the way that I'm gauging these colors actually is that I'm blurring my eyes at the model, and I'm trying to see just spots of color and value. So as you notice that the colors are progressively darker as the paint gets closer to the bottom of the palette, and that's on purpose. I'm trying to have a gradation of values using as much paint as I can onto the palette. I really want to minimize the amount of time that I have to spend mixing, so I'm going to use my size 4 filbert here to mix this generic mixture of basic flesh tones, but not so generic in this case because I'm actually tinting the colors based on what I think the final applications of paint will be. And yes, you did see me switch brushes. I do keep brushes for lighter values and some brushes for midtones and other brushes for darker values. And so I pretty much have a brush for the lightest light, a middle light, a dark light, and then the dark dark. And so I'm using my size 4 filberts to make this mixture, but then once I get into the actual flesh tones on the canvas, I will be using smaller synthetic round brushes. As I mix up these flesh tones, you'll notice that the basic kind of arrangement of the puddles of color are a pretty good variety of warms and a little bit cooler as we get closer to the darker values. But on the right side of the palette, I'm actually going to mix up some cooler colors. Not quite gray, but kind of cool. So ivory black is actually a pretty nice muted blue. And now my brush is tinted with a little bit of the flesh tone mixtures because I didn't clean off the brush. And I did that on purpose because I didn't want something so ice cold. If you notice that when you mix ivory black with titanium white, you will get a pretty cold color. I don't want it to be too cold, so that's why I left some of the flesh tone mixture that was already on my paintbrush. So this limited palette is actually pretty useful. I found it very useful for me in portrait painting. And also another color that you can get out of this is a nice green, a nice muted green. And the way to do this is with yellow ochre onto the titanium white, a little bit of titanium white onto the yellow ochre, and then a tad bit of the ivory black. And I'm using a palette knife to mix this just so I don't have to clean off another brush. And so I may or may not use that mixture, but I thought it'd be nice to have it. Alright, so now I've switched over to a little size 1 round brush, a synthetic round brush, and I'm going to call this little guy my scrubber. So this little scrubbing brush I'm using to put just a little bit of a darker muted flesh tone, and I'm very thinly scrubbing the paint onto the forehead, and I'm going to be rendering this forehead. I'm going to be developing the gradations of value, creating the form on this area of the forehead. But first I'm going to use my little scrubber here to apply just a little bit of a darker value as the side of the forehead wraps around closer to the corner of the model's right eye socket. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side for the model's left eye socket as the forehead wraps around of the head. And I don't want to keep it in this kind of Mr. Potato Head fashion. I'm going to loosely scrub a little bit of paint onto it, very thin, darker and warmer, so that I can build my colors on top of it. Now switching over to a different brush, another round synthetic brush. It is a size 1 round brush. I'm now going to be delving into my lighter mixtures of flesh tone. I'm very quickly going to pick an area that's receiving more light. Now if you look at the forehead on the actual model, the forehead, the area near the front of the skull is receiving a pretty good amount of light. So I'm going to work with that region, and right now I'm painting onto the frontal ridge of the model's skull. Not trying to picture the bone so much as I'm trying to picture the structure of that plane. So I'm picking out my lights fairly early on as I build these values relative to one another. And the planes that are lighter are most perpendicular to the light source. So the photo reference was taken under a natural lighting, so there was actually a skylight, so the light is coming from very high above the model's head. So as you notice, I'm painting this high lit region of the forehead now. This plane right here is perhaps the most perpendicular plane to the light source. And as the planes start to angle more and more parallel to the light source, that is when shadows start to develop. And again, I'm still trying to keep that mindset where I'm drawing the pose, not the model. Let's think about this as a puzzle instead of a portrait. And if that idea is not sitting well with you, if you don't like puzzles, which I really enjoy puzzles, and in particular I like math puzzles and things like that, but think about it in a way that is not painting. And I know that's kind of strange, but I'm trying to pick a region of the forehead that is receiving the most light, that is spatially most perpendicular to the light source, and then I start to move my values across that area, creating the roundness of that frontal area of the forehead. Now it's not perfectly round like a basketball or anything like that, so I want to be a little bit more articulate with the way that I apply the paint. Now notice how I'm just flattening out this area right here. So this area is directly below that more curved region of the front of the model's skull. This is the frontal ridge of the skull. Think about it kind of like the roof on the top of a building. Not quite that extreme, but it's pretty flat. It's pretty flat and it's not as round. So in areas such as the glabella that I'm painting right now are more flat. This area of the glabella is much more flat than the front of the model's skull. So take into account the actual curvature of the form that you're looking at. That's why I think of it more like a puzzle than I do a portrait. And that's pretty much just for the analytical side of creating form and structure, because they are very concrete things. Now we're going to move on to the model's left eye socket. So I filled in a generic flat, warm flesh tone for that region, kind of setting up the perimeter for the the forms that are going to rest on top of them. So I just had a flat value for that region and a side plane that's a little bit perhaps too blue, a little bit cooler, overemphasizing that color, but the value itself is a little bit darker as it rolls across the side of the face. And now going in with a lighter value for the corner of the tear duct. So I have picked the area that is most perpendicular to the light source, and that is the area to the left of the tear duct. And now as I move across that lighter area, I'm going to be filling in a value that is very light, almost perpendicular to the light source, but not quite. So it is lighter. This region here of the eyelid is lighter than the areas above it for the eye socket. So I'm going to go ahead and add more light to it now. It is very light, but it's not quite as light as that highlight region by the corner of the tear duct. And I'm trying to think about each brushstroke as a plane. So I'm trying to create form via planes. So remember, a plane is a conceptualized idea of a three-dimensional sheet of paper, if you will, in space. A plane is just a flat region of value. And as I paint in the white of the eye now, known as the sclera, I also know that that is not white. Not white at all. And so now I'm putting in another transitioning value from the upper eyelid across to the inside of the model's eye socket, and then putting a little more value now across the corner of the tear duct. I'm going to go into the cooler region of my palette, just a little bit of a neutral gray, probably created with white and burnt umber and a little bit of the ivory black. As you notice, the white of the eye, known as the sclera, is fairly light. Its local value is much lighter than that of the surrounding flesh tones. And so I made it a little bit lighter, but I'm also considering the fact that it is not receiving direct light either. So now with a little bit of pink here for the inner corner of the tear duct, just a little bit of the pink, and then I'm going to go in with a little bit of the burnt umber and create a little accent here for where the top of the eyelid is overlapping with the eye, trying to avoid that lemon looking generalized shape for eyes. Instead, I have the top of the curve of the eye a little bit further to the right of the canvas. And now I'm going in with the burnt umber and created the shape of the iris. Now for the iris and the pupil. Right now the iris is it needs to be a little bit lighter, so I put in some of the yellow ochre into the mixture. I perceived it to be a little bit warmer, and then for the pupil, just a tad bit of burnt umber with the ivory black, but I don't want it straight black. So the pupil is dark, but it's not straight black. And now for the highlight, a little bit of the titanium white with the flesh tone mixture. Just a little bit of that will give me the color that I want for the highlight. I don't want the highlight to be straight white, and I don't want the dark of the pupil to be straight black either. So they may be very close to straight white or straight black, but not quite that intense. So now back to the scrubbing brush, putting in a darker value for the bottom of the lower eyelid. That region of value is a little bit darker. So with the little scrubbing brush, I'm now putting in some more flesh tone now, darker basic flesh tone for the bottom of the lower region of the model's tear duct. This area is a plane that is receiving a little less light than the surrounding planes on the eye. I'm using this little scrubber here to set up the stage for the future values and the future colors to be placed on top of. So that region had a little more light than the bottom of the lower eyelid. This region to the side of the face is also receiving less light. But it's also important to note that none of the values in the light should ever be confused with any of the values in the shadow. Even in this lighting situation, even in this natural light, there should not be any values in the light confused with any of the values in the dark. Now going to be putting in some light for the top plane of the model's lower eyelid. This region here is receiving a little bit of light, not quite too bright. It's not as light as the upper eyelid, so that means that it's not as perpendicular in space relative to the light source. And now transitioning value from the top region of the model's eye socket as this form wraps around closer into the upper eyelid. I went a little bit, I exaggerated the warmth of that plane a little bit, and so now I'm neutralizing that plane with a little bit of the cooler neutral values that I had on the right side of the palette. And each form has a boundary and a transitioning area. So this is a different form. This is a form now, the inner cavity, if you will, of the eye socket, this darker value. And the transitioning of that form into the upper eyelids is a transitioning value of which you are receiving less and less light as you approach the dark of the inner cavity of the eye socket, and more light as you get closer to the upper eyelid. And here we are on the side of the eye socket receiving much less light, so I'm darkening it just a little bit more. I'm also well aware that the rate of the curvature of the model's upper eyelid is a much faster curve than the curve of the eye socket. That band of value above the upper eyelid is curving much less dramatically. So a fast curve is a curve that has a lot of gradations of value. A slow curve is closer and closer to a flat plane. So the slow curve has less and less of a dramatic change in value. So once again, look at the upper eyelid. That is a fast curve. It's turning much more rapidly as it wraps around the model's eye. Remember that the eyelids are meant to protect the eyeball, so they're wrapping around the eyeball, and then the curvature, say to the bottom of the model's tear duct that I'm painting right now, is a much slower curve. So that transition of value is closer to being flat. It's closer to a flat plane. And so also recognizing the curvature of the form that you're working with is also pretty important in the overall development of the form, of the rendering of the form. Now this side plane of the nose that I just introduced is much more flat relative to the actual curvature of, say, the top of the model's upper eyelid. So I'm going to keep referring one form, comparing the curvature of one form to another form. And so now we're moving our way to the top of the model's nose. Now this region is more curved than, say, the bottom of the tear duct. And it's receiving much more light here as we get closer and closer to the nasal bone. This area is receiving much more light. And now I'm going to work the side plane on the other side of the model's nose. And it's pretty much symmetrical to the other side of the nose, so I'm going to approach it much in the same way. I'm just going to flatten it out a little bit with this darker warm color, and then I'm going to paint right over it with a lighter and a little bit more of a cooler value. And now you're seeing the picture in black and white. So this can prove to you that it is that value relationship that creates the form. And if that were not true, if color alone would dictate form, then this would not hold an image. Now, this doesn't have much to do with form, but also make sure to step back quite frequently from your painting. And that's something that I had to do off camera, of course. Stepping back and forth is something that is really important in the overall development of your big picture. Remember, the big picture is the most important thing that you can develop in the painting. Remember that you want your painting to look its best from, say, 10 feet away instead of, say, 10 centimeters away. And that can kind of become a bit of a task when you're working in this kind of fashion, where you're spending a long time in one particular area trying to study all of the forms. So just remember that each form has to work in relation to the surrounding forms. And now we're going to do much of the same kind of thing to the model's right eye that you saw on the model's left eye. So here we are with the pupil, the same kind of dark ivory black with burnt umber, but not quite black. And then when we get to it, the iris is going to be with that same kind of yellow ochre, burnt umber type of mixture. And so right now I'm just trying to establish the shape of the iris first before I put in that color for the hazel eyes. Just a little bit of the yellow ochre and some of the flesh tone colors will be used for that. And the highlight that I used, just a little bit of titanium white onto the burnt umber. Now the highlight is not straight white, but it's also not quite so pink. It's not an easily discernible color, but it is a color, so that's why I used a little bit of that color. And then now for the color of the iris, the same kind of mixture, a little bit of the yellow ochre onto the dark burnt umber that was on the brush, and that's really all I want to do for the iris. And it does do quite a bit, just a few values really. If you look at the iris, it's just perhaps 3 values. Moving on to the nose, I'm going to be applying the same type of reasoning, looking for the areas receiving more light being more perpendicular to the light source, areas receiving less light, so closer to parallel to the light source. And so I'm going to start with the side plane, the side region of the model's nose. I'm thinking about the angle of the plane of the side of the nose, and I believe that it is a little further away, it's angled further away from the light than, say, an area like the glabella. The glabella it's facing the light a little bit more than the side plane of the nose. And of course the top plane of the nose is facing the light a little more than the glabella. So I'm creating a spatial relationship in my head of that plane as I paint it and relating it to other planes so that I can get each value to work relative to one another. And just a little technical tip, I'd like to work from darker values and then gradate them into lighter values. And by gradate, I mean uh, changing the lightness of the value. So remember when I was mixing up the flesh tones on my palette, I was actually starting off with the darker values and then progressively mixed the lighter values. And so now I'm going to do that onto the surface of the nose. I'm going to flatten out just a dark flattened shape onto the nose. I'm actually going to cover the entire area of the nose here, with a very flat and dark value. And then I'm going to work lighter values on top of that. And so I think that it's easier that way, at least for me, to gradate values from darker to lighter values, because I find that when I try to introduce darker areas of paint onto a lighter area of paint, it gets kind of messy. I don't quite know why that is, but I know that it's easier for me to put a flat plane on, say, a flat area of dark, say, on the nose like we did earlier, and now I'm going over top of it with another flat plane that is lighter in value. And so gradating the values from that top plane of the nose as we roll across to the side of the wing of the nose and to the corners of the nostril, it will be much easier for me to go from the lighter areas to the darker areas across the side of the nose only after I established that darker value to begin with. And so now I'm placing a lighter value now for the highlight region of the nose. So we're pretty much at three values on the top of the nose. We have the side planes, the top plane, and then the light. So now I'm going to go ahead and add another value now for the wing of the nostrils, the wings of the nostrils. And so remember how I said it was easier to gradate the values from the darker to the lighter, and so that's what's going on here. It is much more simple for me to apply these lighter values on top of the darker values. Easier for me than if I were to have gone with the lighter values and then the darker values. But that may just be preference. It might just be my preference to work that way, but I find that it's a lot easier to get a nicer gradation of value from light to dark. A simple and smooth gradation from light to dark. But also note that not all areas, as I mentioned before, are curved at the same rate. Notice this flat region on the top of the nose. This region of her nose is much more flat on the top, and then it curves more as it rolls across to the nostrils, the side of the wing of the nose. So the side of the nose, the wing of the nose, is a much faster curve than the top plane of the nose. The top plane of the nose is a much more slow curve, somewhat closer to just a flat plane. And then as we roll across the side of the nostril, it was more curved. I'm going to be using the light flesh tones just to push up this this shadow shape at the bottom, near the bottom of the nostril. I'm just using it to push it just a little bit higher and to shape it a little more. I'm just trying to work the shape of the bottom of the nose. Just pushing it just ever so slightly, pushing it forward. Alright, back into my scrubbing brush, the scrubber. I'm going to be scrubbing a darker plane now for the zygomatic region of the face, the cheekbone region of the face, a nice simple dark value here. And then going to be gradating the values up from there. And of course I pushed that a little bit darker than it needs to be, almost exactly like I did with the nose. So it's easier for me, I find, to work from that darker value up into the lighter values. It's easier for me to gradate the values in this fashion. With each region, with each patch of paint, I'm really thinking about the structure in relation to the light, source. So this area on the bottom of the cheek is receiving a good deal of light, and it is still receiving less light, however, than the areas closer to the top of her cheeks. This area on the side of her cheek is also receiving a good deal of light, but not as much as this region over here. And so I'm rapid firing between the palette and the painting. I'm not trying to spend too much time mixing. I already thought about the large colors beforehand onto the palette. So notice as I put in that little final patch of value, it is a little bit lighter, but just ever so slightly. And now putting in another value that is lighter, and this area right here is receiving the most light on this particular region of the face. It's more perpendicular. It's closer to a perpendicular line relative to the light source. All that means is that it's facing the light more. This region is facing the light more than the region across the side of the face, across the cheekbone, and receiving even more light than the bottom of the cheek. But I'm not trying to generically make this a round shape. Now I'm trying to avoid the Mr. Potato Head look. I'm trying to paint planes and curves. And I'm thinking of the rates at which certain areas are curving. So the top plane of the cheek, that high-lit region of the cheek, is much more of a slow curve, so it's closer to being planar. And the side of the model's face, this area right here, is more of a fast curve. So you can picture it, you can picture the form rolling around the side of the face. So the values on that fast curve over here are receiving much less light as it gets closer and closer to the jawbone, closer and closer to the mandible, where that region becomes parallel to the light source and is then, of course, in shadow. And I like to paint from one side of the face and then relate it to the other side of the face. So we human beings have bilateral symmetry. So what that means is that one side of the face is symmetrical to the other side of the face, and this is certainly not true if you're thinking about it like a purist. That is, we all have little differences between one side of the face and the other side of the face. Think about bilateral symmetry as like a starfish. A starfish would be a good example of bilateral symmetry. But, of course, that is not a perfect star. A starfish is not a perfect star. And of course, our faces are not perfectly symmetrical, and that's what I think makes us individually beautiful. It makes us individually unique. Those differences are what make us unique. But in any case, this area across the side of the face, I'm going to kind of mimic the other side of the face, but I do know that since the pose is a little, it's pretty centered, but kind of 3/4 to the right, that shape, that dark light that I just painted in right now, I'm seeing much less of that dark light than I am seeing on, say, the right side of the canvas. And of course, I'm gradating the values from dark to light. So I'm moving up the face, and I'm also moving up on the value scale. Notice this plane here for the top of the cheekbone, the zygomatic region. Remember that diagram I showed you earlier? That band of value represents a plane, the top plane of the cheek, and now we're moving even higher up to the more highlight region of the top plane of the cheek, and that area is, of course, symmetrical to the other side of the face, and therefore it is a little more perpendicular to the light source, and everything that gradates across from that is receiving less and less light. And I'm trying to, of course, avoid the Mr. Potato Head look where it's just completely a generic round curve. I don't want it to be perfectly round. It is more planar on this area right here across the side of the zygomatic region of the face. This area is more planar, so it's a slower curve than the curve as we get closer and closer to the right side of the model's face. And so now let's create those values across the side of the model's face. So of course I'm going to go in a little bit darker than I need to on this particular region of the face, because this is a fast curve, because it's turning quite rapidly across the side of the face into the mandible. and then gets closer and closer to the corner of the face, then receiving less and less light. And so I'm going to be moving up the value scale from here. So that dark flat region of paint is then going to be used to paint lighter and lighter values on top of. And I should also note that these values are a little bit cooler. So they're closer to that more neutral gray color, but not quite gray. Flesh tones are kind of hard to describe because they imply ish, so it's like orange-ish, it's gray-ish, or it's pink-ish. But in this case, the side of the model's mandible, that fast curve that I was talking about, is a little bit more gray-ish. It's a little bit cooler, but not super cold. And then as we roll across to the top of the orbicularis oris, remember that plane that I showed you in the diagram that I made earlier, the orbicularis oris is that region that encompasses the mouth. It's that muscle that allows you to make that kissing face. And so now I'm rolling across the other side of the face now. So I'm moving from side to side to the fast curve around the model's right side of her mandible, and then moving the scrubbing brush closer and closer to the orbicularis oris. So with the scrubbing brush, I'm moving quite freely around the bottom area of the model's chin. And that's because I'm just trying to cover it with a dark value, but that is still lighter, of course, than the surrounding side planes of the model's face. And I am going to go over top of this area of the chin later in the video and create that light plane of the chin. And here I'm trying to put that indentation for the bottom of the lower lip, that orbicularis oris structure that I'm creating right now. It's a nice indent. It's a nice value to place in there, and I don't want to overthink any of this. I'm bouncing my eye back and forth from the model and the painting, and I'm not trying to copy it. Now remember, you're trying to draw the pose, not the model, and you're trying to create a painting, not a photograph. So in that respect, I'm reasoning with the canvas. I'm trying to reason with the canvas. Each and every value has a corresponding spatial relationship to the other values. Now I know it all sounds kind of mathematical and very absolute, but there can be a lot of freedom in the way that this is done. I'm painting in this lighter value now, and I'm not really thinking too much about a formula. I'm more thinking about the structure of the model's face, so it doesn't have to be so mathematically precise. So now I'm mixing up a little bit of my cadmium red light and some of the cadmium red medium and some of my burnt umber and a tad bit of the neutral gray to create a nice hazy type of deep red. So I'm choosing to render certain areas more than other areas. So what I'm trying to tell you is it doesn't have to be so mathematically methodical or precise. The only thing that really has to be taken into account when you're trying to create form is that spatial relationship from one area to the other. And so now I'm painting that deep red for the dark shape. I'm just flattening out one dark shape for the upper lip. Now remember, as I mentioned, that it is easier for me to work from a dark to the light, working from the dark to the light. And so I'm going to do the same thing with the lip, just flatten out that dark area. And then I'm going to come back in and introduce some lighter values for the upper lip as it gradates closer and closer to the accent. The accent being that dark value where the upper lip meets the lower lip. And I'm going to mix up my cadmium red medium onto the halftone region of the palette, and with a little bit of titanium white onto the colors that were already existing to give me a nice neutral pink, a neutral pinkish kind of color. And I'm going to take some liberties in how I use this color. So I'm going to actually use it for both the bottom lip and the upper lip. So here I have the nice neutral pink that I mixed up, and I'm also going to apply it to the upper lip. Now remember, I said it's easier to gradate the values from darker to lighter, and so that's what I'm doing. I'm applying the paintbrush first onto the areas that I want to be lighter, and then slowly with less pressure applying paint onto the areas that are getting a little bit darker. So you can think of it like blending if you want. I'm using the colors that were already on the paintbrush and on the canvas to create this gradation of value. Now I could have went the other route and mixed every single little shade of color for the upper lip, but I didn't want to take that time, and so I used that same mixture now to apply to the side of the lip, still using that same mixture of paint that I had before. So I'm pretty much trying to economize time here, and I'm prioritizing the values and the spatial relationship. So see, just this, use the same puddle, the same mixture for that gradation of value onto the lips. And now I'm mixing up a lighter value. And of course, I'm mixing on the top region of my palette. So I'm utilizing the gradation of values on the palette to help me gauge what that value is relative to the values surrounding it. So this is going to be the top most high lit region of the chin, and it's pretty flat. It's not generically curved, so it's not too curvy. It's very well defined on the model's face. So I painted pretty much just a flat plane for that region, kind of looking like a triangle, and then I'm going to be gradating the values across from that as it gets a little bit darker as it rolls across the side of the chin. And all of this is just below the orbicularis oris. So again, I'm thinking about each area of paint, each region of paint here, and I'm thinking about where it is in relation to the light. What is that angle in relation to the light? So as we roll across this highlight region of the chin, we're going to be receiving less and less light. And so I'm going to be painting according to what I perceive the structure of the chin to be. It is a little bit darker as we roll down to the bottom, say the top of the curvature of the model's chin. And then as we move across, say closer to the side of the mandible, it's going to be even darker as we get closer and closer to the shadow. And so what I'm doing now is I'm trying to work that fast curve, so that very rapid gradation of values from the top of the model's chin as it gets closer and closer to the bottom of the chin, and then curves to create the bottom of the neck, which is something you can't see, of course, because the face is more frontal. So I'm just working the transitioning values. I'm painting the value across the side of the orbicularis oris and then connecting it to the bottom lip. So where shapes connect with one another can be thought of as a pathway. So that was a pathway. This plane here is going to be another pathway between the side of the orbicularis oris and the bottom of the model's chin, rolling across to the plane that we were just painting earlier, wrapping around the bottom of the model's mandible. So each and every structure has a kind of interconnectivity between one another. So like the side plane of the nose wrapping around across the side of the cheek, that is a transitioning structure, and then the glabella itself you can think of as a transitioning structure, transitioning from the top of the model's forehead into the areas in between the eye sockets. So now I'm going to be using a little bit of the medium that I had with some burnt umber and ivory black, a pretty dark color, and I'm going to just reestablish this outside edge of the model's face very carefully, cutting across the side of the model's face ever so slightly, trying to reestablish that edge. And so with the form you have the value, and then you have the color, but then you have the edge. And so I'm thinking about this edge quality, the boundary between the side of the model's face, and that aesthetic can be pretty cool too. You have a nice sharp outline, but I'm going to of course gradate the values even more across the side of the face. So I don't want the edge to be the same consistency throughout. So it's going to be a little bit sharper closer to the ear, and it's going to be a little softer as it approaches the mandible, and then it's going to sharpen again as it goes closer to the neck. You can play with the how hard or how soft the edges are based on what you want to emphasize. And so I sharpen the edge closer to the ear because I want to emphasize that region of the face, and I want the values closer to the mandible to recede. So that's why it's a little bit softer, because I want it to recede. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side of the face, just ever so slightly, with a gentle outline, just carving and reinforcing the outside shape of the model's head. And again, I'm going to soften the edge beneath the ear. So the edge of the mandible, I will try to soften it because I want that region to recede and to seem further away in space than, say, the edge across the ear. I want that one to come forward a little more, so I will have that edge a little bit sharper, but softer as it rolls across the mandible. And so now I'm going to mix with my larger brushes, my size 4 filberts, in the halftone region of the palette. And I'm going to be mixing up the values for the neck. And so the entire structure of the neck, of course you can think of it as a tube. That's what we always think of when we think of a neck. But the neck actually has some pretty predominant planes that are kind of important. So we have the strand that I'm painting right here is actually the sternocleidomastoid. And so that muscle is the one that connects to the side, right to the back of your ear. Now, I'm not an anatomist, so I might be getting some things wrong here. So basically, the structure of the neck is, you can think about it as a cylinder, but not really, because it has two strands of muscle going from your clavicle, this area right here, the crest of your clavicle, or the sternum, and then moving across the back of your ear. And it's not as predominant in this photo reference, but it is there. Her neck is not a complete cylinder. It does have this highlight region, the highlight plane that I had just painted, and I'm going to emphasize it even more with a lighter value. So that region rolling across the side of the neck is the sternocleidomastoid, and it is also displayed on the other side of the neck, but you can't really see it too well because it's in shade, so I'm not going to bother with it too much. And so now we have the light on the shoulder. So that shoulder is being created by the trapezius muscle moving around the back of the neck. And the trapezius muscle is that big, large muscle on your back. You can feel it if you move your arms as far back across your back as you can, or if you try to stretch your arms all the way forward, you feel the trapezius muscle. And so just there we have a little light for the clavicle bone, or you can think of it as the collarbone. So let's think about the neck now as a collection of units, a series of units, if you will. So you have the cylinder of the neck, and then you have the sternocleidomastoid, those tubes that I was talking about, those muscles across the back. Then you have the trapezius forming that top plane that I mentioned earlier, and then you have that highlight region for the clavicle or the collarbone. And then on the bottom, the lightest light in the bottom of the neck is formed by the suprasternal notch. And the suprasternal notch is pretty much the middle of or you can think of the clavicle bones from one shoulder to the other. The suprasternal notch, if you put your finger to the middle of the bottom of your neck, is that little indent, that little bone. And it creates that light, that little highlight region directly in the center of the bottom of the neck. And with the same idea that we had across the side of the face, just a nice little line to clearly define the edge of the neck. So that light wash of dark value for the dark mass of the hair, remember I said it would kind of sink in, it would kind of settle into the canvas. Well, it kind of did that now. So I'm going to apply the final layer of value onto the dark mass of the hair. So it's pretty much burnt umber and ivory black and a little bit of the colors that were already on the darker region of the palette. Just so I stay away from introducing jet black. I don't want to make the hair too dark, though the hair is pretty dark in the photo reference. I just know that from working from life that nothing is really that black in the hair. There's always something that's going to be darker. And hair itself has form. I know hair can be thought of as just kind of an add-on, but there are planes. You can subdivide the hair into areas of light and dark and with planes, and so that's what I'm doing right now. I'm painting the top plane of the hair, if you will. This area is receiving more light, and it's pretty light and it's pretty cool. Cool as in cool in temperature relative to other areas, but I'm gonna use a little bit more of the flesh tone mixture into the color that's already on the hair. And I think it's just my own aesthetic that I want the light, the highlight regions of the hair to be a little bit warmer. I don't like to air in that cooler gray into the hair. Now the next thing I'm going to do, and perhaps the last thing I'm going to do to this painting, is just a little bit of a cooler reflected light onto the corner of the model's jawbone. Just a little bit. Just a little touch of light on this corner. Not overly bright, but just a tad bit of reflected light. And there you have it. I'd like to thank you so much for watching this week's portrait painting demonstration. I hope it helps you out, and I hope you have a wonderful week, and stay tuned for next week's video. Thank you. And if you'd like to see more of my artwork on a more consistent basis, or receive updates on what the next portrait painting video will be, please feel free to check out or follow my Instagram page. And I'll leave a link in the description below to my Instagram. Thanks again.